Can give me a little microphone. Since we had a little mix-up on the name tags, it said 9:30, but the program said 9. We're probably going to start about 15 minutes late and meet in the middle and see if we can give everybody some time to get here, okay? So we got another 15 minutes before we'll get going, and then we'll just push everything back 15 minutes, okay? Thanks. Welcome back, friends. Good morning. This is why we gather, to spend time together. I hope that you had a good evening and got some rest and are ready for a great second day. Again, because we had the mix-up on the name tag, since it said 9:30 and the program said 9 o'clock, we decided we would just start at 9:15, meet in the middle, and hope that folks continue to come in. And so we're glad that you are here. Last night, we focused on Baptist Women in Ministry's past. We heard the stories of the beginnings of our movement. We participated in worship that called us to both remember and to move the light forward into the true belonging of who we are. Today, we will still honor that history, and we will extend the remembrance to our banquet tonight. But we also want to name, as I alluded to in my opening words yesterday, and as our foremothers so keenly articulated in the documentary last night, that our movement has been largely focused on white women. Our organization began out of a need for advocacy and community for women in ministry within the Southern Baptist Convention in the 1980s, which was, and in most cases still is, predominantly white. And for painful reasons that it is predominantly white. Because the SBC that is a part of our organization's history, the Southern Baptist Convention, was started for the purposes of advocating for slavery. Today, we are no longer Southern Baptist Women in Ministry, as our organization's name was from 1986 to 1995. We are Baptist Women in Ministry. No qualifiers on the front, just Baptist women. All Baptist women in ministry. Multiplying our community to truly include and appropriately support Baptist women of different races, ethnicities, and denominational affiliations is part of our dreams and next steps as an organization. So while the women at the forefront of the organization that grew out of our movement were pioneers and trailblazers, there were and are more Baptist women that were also blazing trails among other communities that we don't want to be other, but that we want to be in solidarity and community with. So our dream for the plenary addresses this morning was to hear the stories of those women and those communities, to continue the journey of becoming a beloved community of all Baptist women in ministry. So our first plenary address this morning will be from the Reverend Dr. Carolyn L. Gordon, who will present to us We've Come This Far by Faith, the Emerging Presence and Influences of Black Baptist Women Ministers. Carolyn L. Gordon is the Associate Professor of Mass Communication and Acting Chair and Coordinator of the Convergent Media Graduate Program at Mississippi Valley State University. She also serves as the Associate Pastor of Mount Gaza Missionary Baptist Church in Stringtown, Mississippi. Before relocating to MVSU, Dr. Gordon taught at Fuller Theological Seminary as the Associate Professor of Communication and served as the Chair of the Preaching and Communication Department. On our board, Michael Mills had Dr. Gordon as his professor. Dr. Gordon has also served at Central Baptist Theological Seminary and as the Director of Ministries and Higher Education for the District of Columbia Baptist Convention. She holds degrees from the University of Missouri, Columbia School of Journalism, Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and her PhD in Human Communication Studies is from Howard University. Dr. Gordon is also the former Vice President of Baptist Women in Ministry. Duly ordained by both the Southern and National Baptist Conventions, Dr. Gordon is both a nationally and internationally known preacher, teacher, and conference speaker. She made history in 2010 when she traveled to Tanzania, Africa, to attend the first ever Global Preaching Summit. She was the only female homiletician in the world invited to attend. Please join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Carolyn Gordon.
Thank you, Meredith, for such an amazing introduction. I kind of wondered who that was. And good morning to you, my BWIM brothers and my BWIM sisters, my BWIM cousins, step-brothers and sisters, uncles, aunts, sisters, and friends. As we begin, let's pray. And then I just want to share with you a little bit about the journey, which is our journey. Our Lord and our God, as I come to you this morning, as we come to you this morning, we thank you for your love for us, and that while we were yet sinners, you died for us. And that, God, we thank you for your creative imagination, and that you would dare to call us and then stand by us and not see through us, but see us through. As we have gathered here, you know the hearts and the minds of those that conceived the idea, that birthed the idea, that has carried the idea, now is raising the grandchildren of the idea. I pray your blessings on anyone hurt. I pray your blessings on anyone confused. I pray your blessings on anyone just looking and hoping and yearning and wanting. Have your way. Allow healing, recovery, redemption, and joy in the morning to come. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Thank you. You know, no matter what, I'm still just a Baptist preacher. And so as I stand before you today, I'm always in awe and I'm always amazed at what God has done with this woman right here. Number one, I was horribly afraid of speaking in public. And the first time I was doing the story, Noah and the Ark, when I was, so I'll get there, but we had Baptist Training Union. And so we had the children's Bible story. And so I was doing the children's Bible story of Noah and the Ark. When it got to the point where Noah kept saying, it's gonna rain, I abruptly ended because I had to go to the restroom before it rained. It's amazing that God would raise up a Carolyn Gordon. I was raised in a church that not only did not believe in women preachers, but advocated otherwise. In fact, my pastor, who I love dearly, who was my mentor, who was my friend, taught us that women were called to be missionaries and not called to be preachers. But yet I marvel. And as I tell you the story, we'll get back to here, because I know some of you all are even wondering how I became ordained both Southern and National Baptist. Well, you're going to have to stay awake and stay with the story. Understanding Black Baptist women, which are Baptist women in ministry, you have to understand that our struggles are same and different. B.B. Moore Campbell summed it up in a way like this: your blues ain't like my blues. But I add, but we're all singing the blues. It's part of the rhythm, it's part of the rhyme, and it's part of our stories. We all got scars, and like I told Mary this morning, we all got scars, but they heal, and they just testify to what we have survived. And so when we take a look at Black Baptists, I want to provide a background history of how we got here. Now understand, because of the fact that we intersected at different points in this whole Baptist thing, we, as far as our history as women preachers, our history as Black women preachers, we go back and we reclaim everybody. So for us, the first woman preacher that we have heard of and that we know is Jarena Lee. 1816, she was the first woman that we know of in recorded history who said she wanted to preach. She was birthed out of the AME church. Richard Allen was the president of Bethel AME at the time, well, the pastor, had started the church, who left the Methodist church because Blacks were not being recognized. So Richard Allen formed his own church in Maryland, and Jarena Lee was around there. And she felt her call, she acknowledged her call to him, and he refused her call. Eventually, he heard her preach and realized she is an excellent preacher, but he acknowledged her but could not validate her. So they would allow her to preach, and she traveled and she preached. In fact, sometimes he would let her preach in front of the church before church would begin to get people to come to church. So in a lot of ways, she was the opening act. In her history, at one point, she traveled over 1,000 and some odd miles one year, preached over 1,800 sermons in one year, because the calling was real, the fire was real, and even if she didn't have the validation of her denomination or faith base, it didn't uncall her. In 1843, you have heard of her, Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth actually got her name because once she accepted Christ, she said, God has called me to tell the truth and to journey in this process. And so in taking on the name Sojourner Truth, what she did, literally, she walked, she preached, she proclaimed the truth, became a friend of Frederick Douglass. She began to fight in the women's suffrage movement. She was around with, I think, Katie Cannon and others, Susan B. Anthony, if I'm not mistaken. And she preached the gospel. We claim her as ours. It was in, I think, 1900, and you all, I'm gonna get these dates wrong, go with me. She preached a sermon, Ain't I a Woman? Again, because the struggle has always been for Black women to not only strive for equality as a woman, but strive for equality and recognition as a Black woman. And this is one of the places where we still, even today, have contention, because as we take a look at a list of our Black women preachers, we were always here. We were always supporting the suffrage movement. We supported, even when they passed the 18th Amendment to prohibit alcohol. We had a sister who was with that, and I need to talk to her one day, but she was there preaching and telling her story. So we've always been here. We've always been with you. The problem, though, we were not sure, in fact, we were sure that you weren't with us. And so that's been part of the struggle, even as we deal with feminism, as we deal with womanism, we deal with the issues of us being in a space that was not designed for us. And so as the story continues, you have Julia Foote, the first woman ordained a deacon. You have Rebecca Cox Jackson, who was part of the Shaker movement because she could find no other place to go. And as far as the Shaker movement, as she became a part of that, she formed the Black Women's Shaker movement. Again, finding her place, speaking her truth. We had Harriet Blake, the first woman to receive literally an appointment as a pastor. Ida B. Wells, we hear her story, but we don't know her story. Ida B. Wells is not so much known as a woman minister, but she would be known as a woman in ministry. Her gift was writing, and she became a journalist, and she recorded and documented all the lynchings. And because she wanted to tell that story, because she became that writer, her newspaper was burned down, she was threatened, she was beaten, she fled her life, and then it's a double dichotomy because on one hand, as she wrote the stories about the racism and confronting the racism, the problem over here was the white people were mad at her for telling the truth, and the Black people were mad at her for getting them in trouble for her telling her truth. And so we claim Ida B. Wells. We have Florence Spearing Randolph. We have Nannie Helen Burroughs, which was mentioned last night. An interesting woman who in herself had her own struggles. Nannie wanted to be a teacher. After she grew up, in fact, she's in Mississippi, went to Memphis, but her color of her skin was too dark, and they would not allow her. So she began to write, she began to teach, she began to do other things, and she worked in the National Baptist Convention. In 1900s, she was giving the keynote address to what was then the Women's Missionary Auxiliary, and her sermon topic was how the sisters are hindered from helping. In 1900. Now you have to understand at the same time, so you'll understand your journey, my journey in our Baptist history. In about 1845, the Southern Baptists split. with the Northern Baptists, 1845, 1865, in that area? Okay, so 1845. So 1845, you had the Northern Baptists, you had the American Baptists. In around 1890s, in the 1890s, and a little bit earlier, Black Baptists came together. There was a foreign mission board, there was a convention, and there was another organization. They came together and became the National Baptists of America group. Okay, National Baptists of America, they came together. That was in, I believe, 1900 something, go with me. Well, they stayed together until they had a fight. There was a publishing board involved, the Boyd Publishing Board. The Boyd Publishing Board was formed out of the National Baptist formation of those three entities. It was the education group, it was the foreign ministry group, and then it was the Baptist ministers, the ministers group, right? Well, then as the publishing board was formed, the fight became who owned the publishing board. Boyd and his family had funded it, founded it, and ran it. But the National Baptist Convention said, but you're under our name. And so we own you. So there was a big fight in 1921, and there became a split. Meanwhile, in 1896-97, the Lot Carey Foundation had formed. Okay, now I need you all to stay with me because this is going to come together. And this is part of your history. For those of you who all slept through Baptist history, welcome to the world again. So here we are. So now we have the Lot Carey who are doing their thing. They're doing foreign missions. They're doing missions because they wanted to save the Africans, their brothers and sisters. You have National Baptist USA America and then National Baptist USA Inc. In 1961, the problem became more real. In Kansas City, Missouri, my hometown, there was the National Baptist Convention. And a brawl took place because Martin Luther King Jr., and I think Gardner C. Taylor was a part of that, they wanted to see not only, they wanted to see a bigger fight. They wanted to move the Baptists, the Black Baptists, towards more of a civil rights a group of fighting. Now, mind you, at this point, women were still struggling to just be. The women auxiliaries had formed, but the women were raised to stay in their places. So with this fight and this brawl, and unfortunately it did not end well, one man ended up dying. There was another split. Then out of that, you've had the Progressive Baptists. Are you all still with me? So we have Lot Carey, American Baptists, National Baptists of America, National Baptists of American Inc. And in all of these conferences, women had to stay in their place. Once the civil rights movement got full-blown, the problem now was, because women had worked in the suffrage movement, women had worked for abolitionists, women had worked for prohibitions, and now we were working for the civil rights. You know some of the names. The problem was, the powers that be in the civil rights movement would tell the women, let us get ours first, and then you can get yours. Unfortunately, because of the theological training going all the way back to the First Baptist, there was that teaching that women had specific roles as helpmeet. Not as preachers, definitely not as pastors, and not as leaders. So somehow, after the civil rights, as the civil rights continued to grow, voices started becoming more prevalent. You had people like Prathia Hall Wynne, who was mentioned again last night, who was an amazing woman, who worked for SNCC, who worked in the civil rights movement, who worked in all that, and in fact, one time she was with the group and literally almost got shot, beaten, housed, put in jail. And yet she had something deeper burning within her that she said she could not deny. Her father was a preacher, her mother was an activist, educator, and something welled inside of her. So in the early 1970s, she went to seminary, garnered 3 degrees, a theology degree, an RA degree, and a PhD. American Baptist Association ordained her. Not the end of the story, because what she also personifies is some of the struggles that Black women have, the burden that the blues that is a part of ours. Because we don't just get to fight to preach. We have to fight to exist. We have to fight to stay above the water. We have to fight understanding that even when the feminist movement came, the ERA movement came, we struggled because we tried to fight alongside of you, and then on Mondays we had to get dressed and go serve you in your homes. And how can you tear down the master's house using the master's tools? And so there we were. We had a sermon, a struggle. We had a struggle that we had to preach through. We had to preach through being a woman. We had to preach through being Black. We had to preach through a society that deemed us as irrelevant and treated us as invisible. In fact, they said there's a paradox of what Black women preachers go through: invisibility versus hyper-visibility. One sense, we are not recognized, we're not seen, we're not invited to the table, space is not made for us, we are accused of being in other places, and we are challenged to stay in our place. The hypervisibility, though, is when we show up and we show up Black, then we carry the burden of representing the entire race at all times. And so therefore, when we mess up, the race is deemed. I've heard stories. We hired a Black person once. You know what? I'm glad I work somewhere else because y'all can't fire me. And so there's always the dichotomy. When you're looking for a Black person, you go get that 1 or 2, that hypervisibility. But then the expression is that once you become with us, you must transform and become like us. And so consequently, even when invited to the party, they can only bring the cups and the napkins because you won't understand the collard greens and the macaroni and cheese and the sweet potatoes and all the other things we bring with us. And so consequently, there's that struggle. And Prathia Hallwin wore it well. It cost her, but she wore it well. And then the journey continued because Ella Mitchell, in 1978, she got ordained. Ella Mitchell is known as the mother of Black female preachers. In fact, she was married to Henry Mitchell, the father of Black preaching, because he wrote one of the first books on Black preaching. Help us to understand what our role is as preachers, but not only that, our style of preaching, which becomes another struggle for Black women as we find our own voice. Because again, our blues ain't like their blues. We don't preach the same way. There's a cadence, there's a rhythm, and as we find our voice and our rhythm, basically sometimes when we don't raise our voice, we're considered to have given a good talk. The paralanguage, the hooping, the zooming, the tuning, all of those things come with it. And we have a constant identity crisis as to how we will be heard in both Black situation and white spaces. And so the struggle is real. And Henry and Ella Mitchell, they both took one of the mantles and they taught us, they walked with us. Ella Mitchell did a phenomenal thing when she started those Preaching Women's books. She has a series of them. And what she did, she published the Sermons of Black Women. What it did for us, that was our way of finding out that there are women preachers out there too. Because at that time, we did not have our folio, but we had yours. Let me stop and tell a story, which gets to where we are. Let me stop and tell you part of my story. I was raised in a church I loved, raised theologically by a pastor I loved, the Reverend Dr. John W. Williams. and his wife, Dr. Marina Bell Williams, which is also part of this history because she was the first African-American black woman to be president, to lead the North American Baptist, let me get this right, the North American Baptist Continental Women's Union. The first one ever. And part of who we are, the hidden figures in the Baptist women's life, is not just those other women ministers, but it's the ones that came before and the ones who walk with us. Our positions before we started preaching, we were first lady of a church. And understand, a first lady is different than the pastor's wife. You're groomed to be a pastor's wife, but to be the first lady, you are the one that models everything for all the other women that come before you and is in your congregation. What you wear, they start wearing. And if you don't wear it right, they will tell you. Okay? They're usually the ones who are over the Women's Missionary Union or the mission group, the women's group. They're the ones who not only support and see the pastor, but also walk with the pastor and other women. It's a heavy responsibility, but that was one of our roles. Another one of our roles was to be the mother of the church. Okay, some churches have one. We were big enough, we had a whole motherboard. Okay. And trust me, the motherboard would oversee you, would carry you, grab you, pull you in the restroom, and have that conversation. Marina Bell Williams did that for me when I was going through one of the lowest points of my life. And she mothered me, and she godmothered me, and she got me to this place where I could stand before you because I watched her do it. And so we had that. We were president of the mission board. We were president of the usher board, but we were not ministers. And so when Ella Mitchell's book came out, it was like a calling card. The hat was thrown up. And we heard the clarion call that we could do this too. And so right around that time, you all were in Kansas City, not you, but the Southern Baptist Convention was voting not to support the ordination of women. Around that time, I was going to Texas to seminary. It was in, you all were, it was 82 or 83. Was it 84? Okay, so I was on my way minding my own business, okay? That's the bottom line. Ask me while I was in seminary, it was a divine setup. I was getting a master's degree, God was preparing a preacher. I came back, you all were in Kansas City in June, I came back to Kansas City in July. My church was having its first town meeting about women in ministry. There were no Baptist women in ministry accessible at that time. And so that night, Reverend Dr. Mac Charles Jones invited a United Methodist minister to come to our church to speak to our congregation about women in ministry. It was that night that, because God had been dealing with me the whole time I was in Texas, that night I accepted my call to preach. God's creative imagination is such that even when you think you are by yourself, God has more than 7,000 that have not bowed. And little did you know or I know that I'm a part of your Baptist history. Because in 1888, that's kind of old, 1988, a strange thing happened. In my journey, in seminary at Southwestern Baptist Seminary, where groups of us blacks, especially women, minister women only had 2 churches they could go to. First Timothy Baptist Church was a little small church in the heart of urban Fort Worth, Texas, across the street from some cow patches. So it's nothing like hearing Moo doing Amazing Grace. That was one of our safe places. And the craziest thing was, because some of the other seminary students were going there, that's where I ended up. The pastor, Reverend James Russell, one day while I was there, and by that time, he and I were the only ones there. We were trading responsibility. The oddest thing was I was preaching every other Sunday, not realizing that's rare. And then one day in the pulpit, he just said simply, when I'm not here, Reverend Gordon's in charge. She's the associate pastor. Okay, this is me. Because sometimes that's how God has to do things, especially with me. There's a shock factor. My sister said to me, because I had been trained by Southern Baptists, it never dawned on me. My sister said to me, so does that mean you're going to be ordained? And I said to her, again in my Scooby-Doo voice, It never dawned on me that that would a consideration or even an option. And I looked at her and I loved her because she's my big sister. And she said, yeah, because if you're going to be the associate pastor, you got to do all the things the associate pastor do. And I'm thinking, how you know that? I'm in seminary. Which she turned out to be a trained journalist and a lawyer. But so I talked to the pastor and he said, you're right, we need to ordain you. Something happened. My home church had licensed me back in '84. The pastor there, Mac Charles Jones, said, but we wanted to ordain you. But now, mind you, let's go to Kansas City. By that time, Reverend Mac had been kicked out of the Ministerial Alliance for licensing a woman. And so even back then, the rule was if you're going to join the Ministerial Alliance of your area, you got to take 2 vows: to support the organization financially and not let women preach in your pulpit. So we were too big for him to just be kicked out, so they just did not renew his membership. And he said, but we want to ordain you. So what was decided was that my church at St. Stephen's Baptist Church in Kansas City on 1414 Truman Road came to Texas and joined with 1 Timothy Baptist Church of Fort Worth, Texas. And it was such a time that they had to literally find people to participate in my ordination. So Dr. Joe Ratliff from Houston flew in. And that night, something happened that even I didn't know the implications. I didn't know that there was a future outside of there. I didn't know. And so as God has called each of us, the journey continues. So where we are as Black Baptists today and women, we have broken barriers that only God could have created, ways only God created. We have, now again, you understand the Baptist infrastructure, the different conventions, and absolutely not until I think a year ago had a single woman managed to get into the executive rim of any of those conventions. In the National Baptist Conventions, both of them, still there are no women, and they're still struggling with women in ministry in some places. I had the good fortune of being invited to be a presenter at the Sunday School Publishing Board of the National Baptist Convention in Nashville. The call itself was phenomenal because when I got a call from my sister. And she said, Dr. Gordon, now this is crazy, but they want you to be one of the speakers. But understand, they not for women preachers. So you're Dr. Gordon, and they want you probably to come do a lecture. The executive director will call you. Dr. Jackson called, and he said, Dr. Gordon, he said, I know they're not for women preachers all the way. He said, but I'm not going to limit you because I'm trying to get them to change. So you come as God leads. The night after I spoke, little did I know that I was the first woman ever to be on the major platform. First woman ever. 2019. How God would have it was that I've been invited back ever since, and this year there's 3 women on the program. And understand, it's not about me, it's about what God's doing. And that's what you gotta hold on to, what God is doing. Not only that, last year and a half ago, the first woman vice president, Dr. Jacqueline Thompson, for Progressive National Baptist. And I believe it's a succession, so eventually she will be president, the first woman in history to lead a national convention. We have Gina Stewart. Some of you know Dr. Gina Stewart, one of the first women to pastor a church in the Tennessee, Memphis area. But she became the president, executive director, forgive me if I missed the title, of the Lot Carey Foundation Convention. In fact, I think she and Gina and Jacqueline in the same year got their position, or Gina was first. But she leads a convention. God is still at work in our lives. And understand, those are just a few, there's so many more. Susan Johnson Cook, American Baptist, one of the first ordained, one of the first pastors, one of the first in the American Baptist Convention. She was appointed in 2010 as the ambassador at large to international religious freedom, and I might mess that title up, by President Barack Obama. Baptist women are doing things. But let me just say this again. It's not just Black Baptist women, they're Baptist women. And so as I stop here, I just want to end with a challenge to you, BWIM. And let me just be transparent. When I first got the invitation from Meredith, I pondered greatly. And I leaned towards saying no. Because when I was on the BWIM in the early 20s, early 2000s, I've been 29 for some years, so back in, the late in the 20, Bethea, I can't think of her first name, was the only Black woman on the Baptist Women in Ministry Board. Then when I came on, I was the only one. And here, as you celebrate your 40th anniversary, I didn't want to come and tell y'all about Black women because I said, y'all should know by now. But because it's not the end of my story, it's not the end of your story. Last night we had some stories, but the challenge I leave with you, Dr. T.B. Maston gave one of his last sermons or presentations at Southwestern Seminary while I was there. And the title of it was The Unfinished Agenda. And he talked about where Southwestern was and the challenge to get where they need to be. My challenge to you, you used to be Southern Baptist Women in Ministry. That's part of your history, but it's only part. And so as you graduate for 40 years, as you move into your next rim, go back and get the rest of your Baptist Women in Ministry story. When you changed it to Baptist Women in Ministry, I know you changed it because you said we want to be inclusive of all Baptists. But now that you have, understand it's not just your name, it should also be your vision. There are Baptist women all over the world in ministry. And I challenge you to, now that you have recorded your stories, you have told your stories, that you go forth getting and collecting the other stories, which are still your stories. And understand that Baptist Women in Ministry are all of us. We are Baptist Women in Ministry. God bless you.
Thank you for that challenge. Thank you. Yeah. We are going to take about a 10-minute break. and we will come back and be challenged even more. And so we will get started back, let's say 10:10, okay? 10 after 10.